Hi guys, I'm Lauren with Watkins Art, and today we are going to be doing a beginner watercolor lesson for you. It's going to be painting this lovely beach seascape. I'm going to be using this as a guide. I'm not going to follow it exactly, but I will be referring back to it to get colors and values correct and kind of proportions in the painting. The colors we're using are phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, gamboge. You can also use cad yellow. We're going to use sap green and mauve. Mauve is just a violet color, so just use whatever violet you have. So I'm going to start off by drawing the horizon line. So this is where the sky and the earth meet. I'm using a ruler to make sure it's nice and straight, especially with it being the ocean. You don't want to have any kind of bumps or lumps in it. I'm drawing that line in the top third of the picture. And now I'm coming in and drawing the foreground where the beachy hills were, or those sandy hills were. And I'm just roughly sketching in the basic shapes I saw in the reference photo. I'm not pushing very hard because I don't want to indent my paper. You don't even have to draw this dark either. I'm drawing a little bit darker so that it shows up on the camera for you. And I'm just marking in those basic lines. I'm not being too fussy. And if I have to erase, I'm using a white eraser. I find that those tend to do a little bit better. Sometimes the pink ones can stain your paper. So I'm just erasing any marks that I don't want. Since watercolors are transparent, they don't always cover the lines. And I know that right next to the beach, the colors are going to be pretty light in value. And so I'm just lightening up everything once I'm done sketching it out. I also blocked in kind of the shore area where the sand and the water meet, and then sketched in kind of that dock area. So I'm just kind of testing my colors on the top to know how dark or light they are. It's really, really helpful to have kind of a test like strip of paper that you can kind of test the colors on. I've just activated phthalo blue, which was the first one, and ultramarine blue. So phthalo blue is a little bit more green, turquoisey, and ultramarine blue tends to be closer to violet on the color scale. It's more of that royal blue color. Now I'm just wetting the sky. So part of the reason why I activated those colors beforehand, before I wet the sky, was so that when I did a wet into wet wash like this for the sky, I could just pick up the paint and go. Especially for the paper I'm using, this is just Strathmore 400 paper. It doesn't stay wet for very long. And so to get those soft, smooth blends that you get with wet into wet washes, you need your paper to be wet. So mixing your colors and then wetting your paper really helps that process move along more quickly. I'm applying the paper or the paint to the top of my painting. That way it's darker at the top and it fades down to a lighter color. The nice thing about using kind of a wet into wet wash is it allows that paint to flow and move. If it's getting too dark in areas or you want to kind of dab out some clouds in the sky, you can use a clean paper towel to just do that. And I'm just keeping it very, very light. The sky isn't the main focus of this painting. And so I'm not having very much of the painting actually be sky. It's only kind of the top third section of the picture. And then everything else is the ocean and the beach. So whatever you kind of want to be the main focus in your landscape, whether it's the sky or the ground, then you kind of make that be what takes up most of your picture, generally speaking. So now I'm letting the sky dry, and then I'm mixing some brown colors using our yellows and our browns. And I'm just kind of testing around what colors I'm using for this piece. So I've got my burnt sienna and my violet, and then a little bit of yellow. And I'm mixing different combinations of that to get various shades of brown. And then I'm diluting them out so that they are nice and pale. So now I'm going to add that to the sandy beach area, that's closest to the water. And I just did this with clean water. I left my brush a little bit tinted just so that you guys could kind of see where I was wetting the paper. It can be a little hard to see on screen. And now I'm adding that light tan color we mixed using burnt sienna, yellow, and a little bit of violet. The violet counteracts the yellow, so it kind of neutralizes it so it doesn't read too bright. Now I'm just mixing up some more colors, just a little bit of our gamboge, so more of an orangey yellow. Sometimes I accidentally grab the other yellow, but I'm trying to mostly just stick to our kind of cadmium yellow color. And this time I'm taking burnt sienna and ultramarine blue, because blue and burnt sienna kind of make gray. And so then you can add them to other colors to kind of neutralize them out as well. And I'm just kind of doing kind of back and forth lines because the beach right next to the water had some shadows where the sand was more wet and where people had walked across it. So I'm just kind of doing some back and forth lines to kind of imply that those markings are there in the sand or imperfections. And I'm doing it with it being wet and wet. That way they kind of flow and blend just a little bit so that they aren't harsh lines. Now I'm adding a little bit of violet to that and just layering this up. This is going to dry a lot lighter than what it appears on the paper right now. That's pretty common with watercolor, that they will dry lighter than they appear. So sometimes you have to be a little bit brave and make things a little bit darker than planned. So once that dried, I came back in and you can see that the beach kind of lightened up a little bit. And then I kind of scrubbed out a little bit along the beach just to lighten up where the sand had gone too far into where I want the ocean to be. Now I'm wetting the area where the ocean water will be. And then I'm coming in with our phthalo blue. This is one of my favorite blues. It's so lovely, but it is very staining. So you want to use kind of a light hand when you're starting out with it. And I'm just coming in and I am just adding it to where I want the ocean water to be. I'm keeping it a little bit lighter in that middle section because that is where I'm going to have the highlights of the light hitting the water be focused. And then I'm just being really cautious of my horizon line, keeping it nice and flat. And then I'm just making it a little bit darker on the left and right hand edges of the paper, with it lighter in the center. Now I'm going to take some ultramarine blue to kind of vary up what colors of blue we see in there, and just darkening up along the horizon lines and just kind of doing like these horizontal brush strokes going across. Now, one thing to keep in mind when you're doing something like water, unless there's waves or something like that, and it is going to be pretty flat. So you want to have your brush strokes be going like from left to right instead of up and down. This will help it read more smooth. If you do it kind of up and down strokes, it's going to read more like a blue tree or a blue bush. So how you lay down the paint will affect how it reads visually, whether it's something smooth or whether it's something bumpy. So just something to keep in mind. So my paper is still pretty damp at this point. It's not as wet as when I first started. So this is turning from a wet into wet wash more into a dry into wet wash, where the paper's damp and the paint that I apply will still feather out and move, but it's not going to move as much as if it was a wet into wet wash. So it just kind of varies it up. And in the center, it's almost dried up enough that you're getting some dry brushing techniques, which is something that we're going to be doing quite a bit for to create those highlighted speckles in the painting. But I need it to dry completely. So I'm going to let that ocean water area dry. And now I'm going to work on the foreground, so the hilly sand area. And this area in the reference photo was very, very light. I didn't have tons of color, and most of the color was coming from the shadows, which read very blue. So I'm just blocking in just a very pale tan color. This is just a mix of the burnt sienna, our yellow, and our violet, just a tiny, tiny bit of violet diluted out with a lot of water. And I've just start blocking it in. And then I allowed that to dry as well. We don't want to be working next to things that are already wet if we don't want that paint to kind of flow into it. So I wanted everything to kind of hold still. So I just let it dry completely and then I came back to it. Now I'm going to work on the ocean, and I'm going to do a technique called dry brushing. So I mixed our sap green and our phthalo blue to kind of get more of a turquoisey teal color. And I am just taking a very dry brush and I'm picking up the minimal amount of pigment and water needed to get it to deposit onto the paper. And I am just gently rubbing that against the top of the paper. This is cold press paper, and so it has a texture to it. It's not perfectly smooth, and that allows you to very easily kind of drag your paintbrush across the top of the paper and allow the pigment to just barely hit the tops of the bumps on your paper instead of going down kind of in the valleys and the cracks. Whereas if this was really wet paint, it would kind of flow all over. The drier the paint you have, also the more control you have on where it moves to. So I'm just doing dry brushing to help create kind of this speckly light reflecting off the water texture. We want it to make it look like the sunlight is glistening on the water. This is also a great way to kind of build up your shadows in the piece. So I did my base painting a lot lighter than what I wanted this to kind of end up. And then I can just do this dry brushing technique to start building up those more of the shadows and the values in the piece. And this is just a reminder, I am going very fast in this tutorial. One, this is like the second time I had painted this picture for prep for my class that I was teaching. And the video itself is sped up to double speed. And so as you're going along and working, pause the video and then come back and we can keep working together. I've had some people that have tried to like follow along right as I'm working, and it's frustrating to them because I don't even paint this fast. I wish I could, but anyways, just remember you can pause the video at any time or slow it down and just follow along that way. So now I've mixed up a light blue color and I'm starting to block in kind of the shadowed areas on this beach. Now, this was not my favorite way I did this. As I said, I had painted this picture a couple times and then I painted it one more time after this live in my class that I was teaching. And I had forgot that I had done kind of a wet into wet wash to mark in these blue areas. And so this one has a little bit more of harsh lines where the shadows are. And if I would have just done it during the wet into wet wash, it would have been a lot easier. But I'm just working with what I did and just trying my best to kind of fix those areas. And so I added that light blue. And then while that blue is wet, I'm adding some more darker browns to kind of reinforce where the shadows are. And now I'm allowing that to dry. And then I'm taking kind of a dry brush and I'm taking our burnt sienna and violet mix and I'm just dry brushing along the beach to create some more of that texture that you can see on it. So where people have walked across the beach, where things are wet, I'm just kind of building up those shadowed areas. And then I'm doing it some more in this foreground area. And just gradually building up the layers. The closer things are to you, the more details you're going to see. And so this is going to read more as the details within the sand instead of like just big blocked out shadows. Then I'm going to let that dry. And now I am back to working on the water. Some areas got a little darker than what I wanted them to be, and so I'm just taking a clean, wet paintbrush and I'm just kind of scrubbing back and forth and then dabbing it up with a clean paper towel. And that's going to lighten up anything that I have put down. Then I'm going to mix up some sap green, and I'm going to use this to make the grass that's growing in the sandy beach. So I did kind of sap green, and then I did a sap green mixed with our cad yellow. And this first color I'm laying down is mostly just cad yellow with a little bit of sap green. And I'm just starting to block in those clumps of grass that are growing in the sand. And then once I got those yellows marked in, then I start coming in with our sap green. And I'm just doing kind of like a light flicking motion to kind of mimic the shape of the grass. And I'm trying to make sure that my grasses are kind of overlapping sometimes. Some are bent a little bit more than others. Some are longer than others. I'm trying to vary up the length of the grass, because if I make it too uniform, then our eye kind of picks up on the fact that it doesn't look natural. Our brains know that organic things such as like grass and tree branches and things like that aren't the same, and that they are all a little bit different. And to help make our picture look more convincing, that it's more of a realistic picture, we need to make sure that these organic things like grass are not too similar and that we're varying up the brush strokes. Some of my students in my class kind of struggled with doing this flick motion for the grass, and they had an easier time kind of doing a pulling motion. And so they flipped their picture upside down and just pulled the brush strokes to make the grass instead of kind of flicking upwards. So sometimes if you're having a hard time painting something, like getting your brush stroke to do what you need it to do, sometimes changing up the way your painting is, or how you're holding your brush can help. The further up on your handle of your brush, so like towards the top, you're going to lose the control you have. And that can be really helpful in making organic things like grass or tree branches. The closer you get to the bristles of your paintbrush, the more control you're going to have. So sometimes even just changing up where you're holding your paintbrush can affect how much control you have and what kind of effects you can get on your painting. Now I'm just adding some more layers of grass. So I have some of the grass that's using kind of a mixture of ultramarine blue and sap green to make it a little bit more shaded, phthalo blue and sap green, and then burnt sienna as well. So I have several different mixes of green, going from like a really yellowy green to more of a blue-gray color, and then burnt sienna. The burnt sienna is just to indicate like dead grass that's in those clumps. And I am just adding them to the various areas on the grass that I wanted to put them in. And I'm just using my smallest paintbrush. This is a size 0, so that I can get really, really fine details for this. You can use whatever size paintbrush you feel the most comfortable using to get small details. The problem with like a really small paintbrush like this is that you have to dip your brush into paint all the time. Especially since this is a synthetic brush, it doesn't hold as much water than like a natural hair brush, and so you kind of have to just dip and go back and forth a lot. But you just need a brush with a really fine point to be able to achieve this look. Now I'm starting to block in the shadows that these grasses are casting onto the sand. So we're having it look like this, the sun is shining kind of from the side of the painting where the ocean is, and then it's casting shadows onto the sand. and we are just kind of reinforcing those shadows. I'm just drawing in those lines kind of in a mirrored shape so that you can see some of the individual grasses that are casting shadows onto the sand. And I really, really like doing kind of a mix of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. It's a really useful mix in creating interesting browns and grays and kind of inky blue colors, because it's kind of that orange undertone in the burnt sienna interacts with that purpley blue color in the ultramarine blue. So they kind of neutralize each other and darken each other up. But I'm using that mix for some of those darker shadows. I'm doing a few little blue dabs on the sand to kind of indicate somebody had walked through there, and there was some bumps in the sandy area, and that it wasn't perfectly smooth. I'm reinforcing some of the dark edges on the shadows and on the back side of some of the grasses, because the front of the grass is in light, but the back side that we're mostly looking at is the shadow side of it. Now, it's not going to be as dark as the cast shadow on the sand, just because the grass is so thin, but I want to darken up just a little bit to reinforce that side is the side that is in shade. I really, really love this reference photo because it really played up to the fact that shadows tend to be more cool toned and blues. And in that actual photo, the shadows are very, very blue on that sand. And it was really, really fun to paint because you could really just play that up a bit. And I'm just kind of keeping a light hand and just kind of doing those back and forth motions with my brush. Whether I'm doing the sand or I'm doing kind of the shadows on the sand, just kind of changing up my brush strokes and just keeping a light hand so it doesn't get too heavy. It's about this point that I realized that I had made the beach section that was closest to the water, the shoreline, just a little bit too narrow. And so I'm pulling up a little bit of brown up into that water just to make it look like the beach is just a little bit deeper than what I drew it as. And then we'll be able to kind of fudge it. The nice thing about it being the shoreline is you have a little bit of flexibility because the water comes in, it comes out. And so it's in constant states of like ebb and flow. Now I'm reinforcing those shadows on the grass some more, and I kind of wish I hadn't, because I think I might have pushed them just a little bit too dark. So when you're painting this, maybe keep them just a little bit lighter than what I did, because I actually liked my first version of this painting where I kept them a little bit lighter more. And that's one thing with painting, is that you can paint the same thing multiple times and it's always going to be a little bit different. And sometimes you overthink things. Sometimes you just were in the right zone or mode of painting on one piece, and the next day you tried painting the same thing and it just didn't work out quite the same. But it's still a learning opportunity. So this was the one I was doing right before I started my class to kind of get me refreshed on what I was going to be teaching. And when I went and taught my class, I kept in mind not to make those shadows a little bit too dark and just kind of make sure that my shoreline is up a little bit higher than what I drew it in this one, because I liked how it looked a little bit more. So I'm adding the dock area. I don't know what these are called. I wasn't raised by the ocean, but they're just kind of piers or like logs sticking in and out of the water. And I used a ruler to help me get a straight line, and just at a gradual angle, I'm just marking them up and doing the little dabs to indicate where they are in the picture. I used my smallest paintbrush for this, and I used a mix of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue for it, but it was mostly burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine blue to darken it up. And these actually get shorter the closer they are to us, the closer they get to shore, and they're a little bit longer the further out they are. And so I'm just keeping that in mind, and I'm just making sure that they kind of stay in that straight line so that it doesn't look a little too squampus. I'm adding just a little bit of a shadow to them and then just kind of blending it out with a damp paintbrush so that it's not too harsh of a line. And I'm just kind of doing those last few details on this painting. This painting's almost done. And then I'm adding a little bit more of dry brushing on the water. Since we did those layers of dry brushing, you can see that little bit of white that's shining through. That's helping us to get a little bit more of that sparkly light reflecting effect. And then for the finishing touch, I'm just taking a white gel pen and just going in and adding a few more highlights to the painting to just really reinforce that. If you have white gouache, you can use white gouache for this and kind of dry brush the white gouache on over the top. If you have masking fluid, you could use masking fluid to kind of protect some of those areas that you want the highlights to be. There's a lot of ways around this. For my class, we only have 90 minutes to do a painting. And so to kind of keep things moving, sometimes it's nice to use a gel pen. Just keep in mind that gel pens are not archival, and so it won't be a light fast thing. So after I did the gel pen highlights, then I started just tweaking the last few details of the painting. I kind of took a break and then came back and saw what I needed to adjust. So I added a few more shadows, and then I'm adding a little bit of green to the water. That way I can kind of tie in the green and the grass a little bit more into another area of the painting. Though if I could go back and paint this again, I would add the green kind of in that early wet into wet wash and then let it dry and pull it in that way instead of adding it over the top like this. The thing is every time you do a painting, there might be things that you like about it, things that you would do differently the next time you painted it. And this was the second time I painted the painting in preparation for my class. And then I went and taught the class, and then I tweaked and adjusted it that third time. So take what you will from this lesson and adjust and tweak however you want to do it. And you don't have to follow exactly what I do. So here is the finished painting. I hope you found this tutorial helpful in knowing how to get started with watercolor and how to do kind of a beachy scene like this. If you want to see more of what I create, please hit the subscribe button and notification bell. That really helps me out. And if you have any questions about this painting or any other thing I've done here on this channel, please leave a comment down below and I will do my best to answer it. Have a fantastic day, and I will see you next time.